Okay, looks like we have a good number of people who have joined, so we'll go ahead and get started. So, welcome everyone to today's Tech Talk. This is a joint event with PKI Solutions and nCipher, and I'm Brian Edwards with McKinsey Worldwide. Today we are talking about PKI challenges for a long-term remote workforce. This is intended to be interactive, so please post your questions in the Q&A tab. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat panel. You can also let us know if you'd like to be mic'd or on video. It's totally your call. Now, first of all, I'd like to introduce you to two folks. We have Mark Cooper, who's the president and founder of PKI Solutions. You may also know him as the PKI guy. And we have also with us Sander Tema, who's a senior product manager with nCipher. So now I will turn it over to Mark and Sander.
Who's going to be joining us here in just a moment, and I appreciate everybody joining us today. We're in a really interesting time in the world, obviously, and we wanted to really give everyone some topics that we could be talking about in recognition of what's going on, and obviously we've got a hyper focus here on PKI at PKI Solutions. And I thought it would be a topic that would be interesting to bring Sander in. And Sander, you and I kind of go back a number of years, ever since I started working with nCipher. And you've been with the company for quite some time, right?
Yeah, that's right. I've been at nCipher through various ownership changes for 14 years.
Yeah, there have been a few changes over time, and I will admit it is a little bit of a difficult thing sometimes talking about what is nCipher versus Talos and so forth. So it does kind of go back and forth with some complexity.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with just a little bit of recap of probably what a lot of you are seeing around the world right now. Now, there's some obviously impacts to organizations and businesses that we're seeing from the COVID process, and some organizations are finding that they were a little better prepared for their workforce than others. We're seeing a lot of increase in the use of things like strong authentication and multi-factor authentication and VPNs. I know that we've been seeing a lot of interest from organizations as it comes to enabling their workforce to work remotely. And that's really been the primary focus of organizations themselves, of how do we get our organization up and running in this new world, really. And an interesting thing, no one has really spent a lot of time in their DR plans that we've seen really planning for pandemics. It tends to be what happens for this data center outage, or what happens if we lose one CA or one particular HSM, and what that rebuild process is going to be. And we're obviously seeing PKI being used in new and different ways, whether that's IoT related or enterprise related. Sander, from the nCipher side, is there significant things that you guys have seen either for your organization or requests that you've been seeing coming in as a result of COVID?
Yeah, I think this is definitely unprecedented. The way what is happening right now. There has not been I know, Mark, you and I live in the United States, but and there has not ever been a disaster, natural or man-made, that has affected all of the 50 states at the same time. Right? We've had fires, we've had floods, we have earthquakes, we've had wars, we've had civil war, but there has never been anything that affected the entire country all at the same time. And I think we can easily expand that across the world. Right. Yep. This is something we now have to all deal with. It comes in waves. Some countries have it a little earlier than others, but we're all confronted with it. And as you say, there hasn't been really in our DR plans. We all have plans. We've all planned for the future, but there is this old aphorism that says no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. And I think this is a prime example. We now get to exercise our plans, but in a way that we haven't been. We've had we've had plans for when the office has been reduced to rubble. We've had plans for when the office has been flooded, but we haven't made plans for situations where we cannot be in the office and we cannot be in each other's presence. And with a product that is predicated upon putting people together to form a quorum of authorization, that is something that is really kind of hitting us and hitting a lot of our customers.
Exactly, and I think the interesting thing is we're definitely seeing organizations either exploiting their PKIs that they have, and perhaps they were doing simple things like TLS authentication or things internal in the network like Wi-Fi. Now realizing that they need stronger authentication on their VPN connections, or they're perhaps in a place of we need a PKI. We don't have anything in place, and I know that we've gotten a number of inquiries in that regard because they didn't have this. But I think that we're definitely seeing organizations that are in the midst of enablement. Like the primary focus right now is keeping organizations going, and we always approach these things pragmatically. Whether you have a DR plan or not, whether something is as secure as it could be or not, it's simply what does the organization really need, and then balancing that with security. Well, I think that really kind of leads us to some interesting conversations, and that is what are some of these next set of issues that are going to arise in this workforce. The DR plans that we do have that are often relating to data center outages or loss of a single CA tend to be relatively short term, or have a lot of assumptions of, well, we'll simply stand up something in a colo facility. We'll move our employees to another location. So there hasn't necessarily been a lot of thought around how do we provide long-term access for our organization, and then also how do we take care of some of the care and feeding of things that we're going to need within the PKI. And I think since we now know that this COVID issue isn't going to go away overnight, and certainly isn't going to change tomorrow, that in many places, I know here in Oregon, we're going on almost 2 months of kind of being in this shelter in place approach, that if this continues for another 30 days or 2 months or 3 months beyond that, we're now starting to get into some of the intervals that we need to start thinking about today as it relates to our PKI. And that really has to do with things like our CRLs, our online CAs, our enterprise CAs that are sitting on the network, are already publishing their CRLs automatically. But our offline systems, our root CAs, our policy CAs, those offline systems typically have a CRL that's published every 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. We could conceivably be in this same state long enough that that's going to become an issue. We also have some concerns around hardware security modules. Sandra, you did a great job kind of touching on this. We often designed a lot of these security controls to make sure that no single actor could ever access those keys. And we create quorums and we have key ceremonies that bring those quorum holders together. And oftentimes it's an inconvenience at worst. But now we have to kind of start thinking about how are we going to go about taking care of some of these things, where we're going to need to do a key ceremony, and I need to figure out how I can get 7 people to a location where an HSM is. And then how do I do a key ceremony that's safe? And then obviously our online systems could be affected as well. If we're going to have to reboot an HSM and we have to reauthorize the activation of keys, these are challenges that are going to start to come up. And Sandra, I know this is an area that InCipher kind of thinks about a lot, is thinking about now how are we going to really start tackling some of these problems? Because fortunately, if we're thinking about it now, we may have a number of weeks to look forward and plan for some of these activities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I have a couple of slides prepared with just kind of an illustration. Oh, I think you you have another slide here.
Yeah, no worries. So, when we think about some of these challenges with the CRLs and hardware security modules, has there been times where you guys have worked with customers, for instance, in this concept of planning for inability to access a CA. Has that been top of mind? I mean, is it something that maybe some people have really kind of sat there and said, you know what if we can't get into this data center for 9 months? How are we going to go about doing this?
Yeah, it's definitely, customers are starting to ask questions about that, and of course we help out wherever we can. It really depends on what the intent and what the policies are behind the security controls on the keys, right? And how do we how do we adapt to this new situation, and can we do that without panicking as part of a plan where, yes, maybe we have to adapt or break the policy, but let's do that right. Let's document it. Let's make sure that all the auditing and controls are in place to substantiate what we're doing here.
Exactly. And some of this isn't just a pure technical issue. There's kind of the audit and compliance aspect as well of kind of thinking through what these are, and organizations really need to kind of start thinking about what some of those upcoming intervals are within their PKI, and how some of these things are going to manifest itself. And I think it's safe to say that no one really knows the magical day where everything returns to normal. So I think we need to be realistic and think about how are we going to operate these in the long term. We can't just turn them off and not have strong authentication for remote workers. Really, the challenge is now how are we going to reapproach these things? So I think there's a couple of things that organizations can begin to do today in recognition of this. So one is you need to start planning today. This is definitely something that you're not going to want to wait until the day before your root CRL expires and you're left scrambling. Even if you don't have a hardware security module, the complexity of getting access to the CAs and getting things published, not just from a technical perspective, but just from a safety perspective. Your organization may rightly so have safety concerns around traveling into the office, getting access, making sure that you have social distancing in place. Even a simplistic model, these offline systems are going to present some challenges. There may be some options that you can do through that planning of thinking about, well, what are our security controls and what are some of the things that we can do to get around that? So I know sometimes organizations will place their root CAs on virtual machines. And, we're not always a big fan of virtual machines because they can be brought on the network a little too easily. Well, this might be one place where the organization can say, you know what, we're going to accept the risk. We're going to turn that root CA on and we're going to get that CRL copied off. But if our CRL is on something that's physically isolated, has an HSM, has some type of ceremony that's out there, you need to start planning today for what are all those controls? Where are things like card sets kept? Where are passphrases? How are we going to get people? And we're facing this with a couple of our customers now where they have two primary data centers, and one of them is in a very remote place, and the key ceremony is 4 people. And we're starting to think through of how can we do a quorum presentation to activate the CA, and we're kind of thinking about kind of a one person at a time quorum of going to the data center, present a card, wipe everything down, leave, next person comes in. Hopefully we don't have timeouts that we're going to have to deal with. And, it's going to take some coordination of how can we do this. And then obviously there's complexity around, normally if we have an auditor standing there or we're having witnesses, that becomes much harder when we're trying to do this in isolation. Are there other things that you can think of, Sander, that organizations could be doing today as far as planning or thinking about some of the complexities when it comes to these offline systems and some of the normal things that we have to do that are going to have to be adjusted?
Yeah, it's definitely a good time to, if you do have to do an extended ceremony, as you describe it, where only one person is in the signing room at a given time. Often these are not very large rooms or large cages in a data center. It's hard to maintain social distancing in there, but perhaps you can orchestrate this. Maybe the auditor can be on a FaceTime and looking in through a phone or something
I was
like that.
I was just thinking that same thing. Maybe you tape an iPhone to your chest with some duct tape, and you have it facing out, and then they can kind of watch what you're doing, voyeuristic style.
Yeah, for instance, or have a tripod with a phone on it, like I have here, to watch along. The state of California is now taking marriage licenses over video conference. So
Yep.
where there is a will, there is a way, and so as long as the as long as the controls are in place, we can be creative about that. But if you have to be physically present, then yes, it is a matter of maintain the social distance and maintain the controls that we have on ourselves, because those are security controls in a way too. The wear a face cover, the wash your hands after you after the operation, or use hand sanitizer, don't touch your face. Those are all controls that we have to minimize the risk of spreading a virus that might stick to a surface somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah, so those are all controls that we can use if we have to go into that physical place, into that data center.
Yeah, and I would probably also add that it's probably a bad idea to assume that this is a one-time exception. In the current state, we don't necessarily know how long this is going to be in place for many parts of the world. That if you can plan through a process and determine what works and what doesn't work, that may be something that you have to repeat multiple times in the future. And it may not even necessarily be something that you are forecasting. Perhaps your route only publishes once a year, and you're willing to make the guess that things will return to normal before then. But you may actually have an out-of-cycle publishing requirement. You may actually have a subordinate CA that becomes compromised, and now you are faced with having to create an out-of-cycle CRL, and you're going to need this process to go back in again. So I think making sure that whatever process you go through, that you take all of these considerations into account for what you plan. If you've had security requirements, key ceremonies, auditing requirements, or even just the simple change log, don't throw them out immediately. Just think through what that process is, what acceptable modifications you can make, and make sure that becomes documented, at least in the short term, of here's what we've done. Make sure the right people are kind of involved in that decision process and saying, okay, that's acceptable. Or it could be a matter of sitting with other parts of the IT security group and saying, we're thinking of modifying this. What are some other ideas that we can do? So hopefully most people are not in the place where they're just going to realize after this webinar that their offline systems are due for something tomorrow. So take this time right now, figure out what that date is, and then start planning for it. Don't wait for the very end. Now, the other reason that I asked Sandra to join us for this is that there's actually some interesting things that InCipher has that we've been using in some of our newer designs that were really designed for something else. And it's kind of interesting to take a look at these things now with the COVID perspective, in that what was previously designed to make it a little easier to assemble quorums when people are remote and not having to fly them together, or making it easier to access and use HSMs, it is suddenly a very real need in the COVID world. So I thought maybe we could have Sandra join us and talk about really two of these unique areas that InCipher has. So if you're in the place of working with hardware security modules and you have these InCipher devices, there may be some options that you have to make it so that you're not having to go into the data center, you're not having to do key ceremonies, that you could potentially do these things remotely from people's homes, regardless of geography. Sandra, you want to tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Mark. So at InCipher, we have a couple of fairly new developments, some newer than others, on the HSMs. And I think the most important one of those is the remote admin that we built into the product about 5 years ago. And this is where we can take the smart card reader in the HSM and basically run that over a network connection. And this requires a little card reader that we can supply, and it has its own its own format smart cards that can set up the trusted connection between the smart card and the HSM, so that the HSM can read and write data from that smart card over an otherwise arbitrary network connection. And so that is very important development in this aspect, in this scenario, because now you can present those controls, those authorization tokens, the smart card quorums, to the HSM without having to stand in front of it. So that can be an important weapon in your arsenal of being able to do this, to do these CRL signings, etc., remotely. Of course, if your root CA is entirely offline, and I know many of them are stashed away in a safe, maybe with the HSM in the safe and the smart cards in a different safe, you have to you have to set something up in person, and maybe you can adapt a little bit and take that to a larger room in your office or in your data center. Get a larger meeting room that you designate the signing room for that occasion, put the video camera in the corner, and do your ceremony in a place where you can maintain a larger social distance. Bring the smart cards out, or set up a remote connection, a remote admin connection from that room into the cage, so you can present the tokens and still have your signing ceremony. So those are a couple of things that you can do with parts of the product. I put a picture of the InShield Edge here. That is our little portable root CA HSM.
And Sander, I think a couple of interesting things that come to bear when we think about some of the flexibility we need with the remote admin. This is essentially the ability that if we put one of these trusted verification devices in the possession of anyone that was part of a required key ceremony, we can essentially activate any OCS protected key that we needed, or any type of HSM admin responsibilities. And if memory serves right, we don't even necessarily have to physically be at the HSM. If we can do a push config to the encipher, if we can get the software installed remotely, for our network connected HSMs, we could essentially have these drop shipped and configure remotely.
That is correct. Yes. So the smart cards, of course, they are pre-configured with a set of identification keys, so that the smart cards recognize and trust the InShield HSMs on the other end, even if they have never been physically in touch with the actual HSM before. That's because they come from the same supplier. We populate them with key material that rolls up to the same authorization.
Yeah, and I think that the one challenge, and just full disclosure here, is there are different sets of cards that are needed for these remote admins. The remote admin style cards, that if somebody's sitting with a quorum card set that's based on the legacy type of card, that quorum's going to have to get rebuilt, which can be done, but you have to present the quorum to rebuild it. So there is a little bit of a chicken and an egg syndrome. But depending on how your environment was set up, if you are using these newer remote admin capable cards, and I think they actually just say it down on the cards now, the remote admin card. If you have those, then you can certainly deploy the trusted validation device. The other thing I was going to point out on the edge is we talk about one of these things in our training course, and this is the concept of a CRL re-signing. So if you think about the fact that if you have a root, you probably have a backup of it somewhere, and the encipher keeps its KM data information, some artifact files that should be backed up, and then you also have your OCS cards. The nice thing is that the edge is completely portable, that if you are able to get access to the edge, you could conceivably take your edge device to another machine. And if you're running a Windows operating system, if you have the KM data, you could do a key ceremony completely remote from the root itself. And I know this sounds a little bizarre, but if our intent is to simply re-sign our CRL so it lives for a longer period of time, we really only need the CA's key to do that. If we're not revoking anything new, which we generally don't need to do on a route, we could potentially have someone go into the data center, grab the edge, grab any kind of a backup we need, and then set up a key ceremony in a safe place outside of the data center, in a workspace somewhere that we need. And as long as you've got Windows and you can install the InCipher software, we can have access to the key. We grab a copy of a current CRL and we re-sign it with cert util. You would still have to do the key ceremony to activate the key, so all the protections are in place, but now we don't need to funnel everyone into the data center. And we could conceivably even do that over virtual machines if we need to, if we could have one person putting all of the cards in and then having other people connect over a VM to the admin switch, and then putting their passphrase in. So there's always some compromises that we can do in those types of scenarios.
Yeah, and so speaking of some of the practicalities behind using remote admin, so the remote admin, the TVD, the trusted verification device that we have, of course, it has a network connection. We have a little piece of client software that sits on the machine that has the card reader, and there needs to be a routable network connection between that and the host that has the remote admin server, which itself is a client of the HSM. We can do that in several different ways. Of course, we can tunnel that connection over an SSH port forward. Remote desktop can actually take the USB connection along. So then the remote admin client lives on the target of that remote desktop session. So that of course takes some configuring and setting up, and that is where the planning comes in, right? You can in fact use multiple readers in different locations. We have tested that. They just show up as different slots of the same HSM, and the HSM can read individual cards from different slots when assembling a quorum of a card set. The only caveat is that the passphrases for the cards, if the cards have a passphrase, then that passphrase is always supplied through the application that takes, that does the act of loading the card set. So that would be the cert util instance, or the starting the ADCS service will prompt you for those passphrases in the remote desktop session that you have active, and so that is something to keep in mind. Also plan for, do you need to separate the cards from the passphrases? Do you need to send those passphrases to the single person that has that remote desktop session, and then after you're done, change the passphrases on the cards or something like that? To as I said, maybe you have to break protocol and then put the protocol back in a way that is organized and not a subject of a panic operation. And of course, as Mark already said, the cards to be used over remote admin, they need to be this particular card format that is remote admin ready. You can transition card sets to remote admin for the root of trust, the administrator card set. You would supply the quorum of the old card sets to build the new card set. That is then the last thing you have to do physically at the HSM, right? But you do need to do that physically at an HSM. That can be any HSM that is part of the security world, either one in your data center, or maybe you have an edge, an InShield edge that you have specifically for that purpose. You can recover signing keys, CA signing keys, to a new card set that is of the new card stock. Of course, that also requires admin quorum authorization, so that security officer control, that administrator card set control, is always in place for those operations. Right? And so that also takes, pre-planning, make sure that you have everything in place. And as Mark says, even if your CRL is designed to live beyond this particular crisis, it could always happen that you have to sign one on short notice. So have your plan in place. It looks much better if you have to turn around and sign a CRL to say, here's the plan to actually do that, than to have to put it together in a couple days. Right.
Exactly. And I think that's a great point. And a couple of things I heard you say I think are really worth emphasizing. And one is the fact that We do have to have the remote admin, but that change from the old cards to the new cards can really be done with any HSM. Where we can reconstitute the quorum. So it could be that we've got one of those edge devices, and we do go through a social distancing safe ceremony once to get those cards changed. And then from that point, we could actually hand out the trusted validation devices. And then for the foreseeable future, and indefinitely, honestly, any future key ceremonies can be done remotely. So any needs that we have come up in the environment, maybe we need to provision a new subordinate for a Palo Alto inspection device, or we're setting up a new CA. We don't have to worry about bringing all those people back in and going through potential exposure concerns. We can really be ready. So that's kind of going back to what I was talking about, making sure that you don't just find the shortcut to facilitate this CRL renewal or facilitate the short-term maintenance, is start planning for how is this going to work in the long term, because we may be able to get over the first hump, but we don't necessarily know what restrictions or concerns or advisories may be down the road. It may be much more difficult to do it. So while we've got some challenges today, we can certainly start planning for how can we be able to remotely manage our CAs in the long term. And it's not just the HSMs, it's also the operating systems and the other physical aspects that go along with it.
Absolutely. This is going to happen again, right? We've had, and again, Mark and I, we live in the United States. We've had it very good. We've had epidemics or pandemics that have gone through other countries in the past decades that have wreaked significant havoc. If I recall, SARS in China caused a very large uptake of video conferencing at the time, even with the resources that we had back then. And so that's going to stay. That's going to stay with us, and being able to plan for this is going to be a necessary part of the future.
Exactly. And now, before we move into the Q&A section, one of the things, Sanders done a great job not plugging too much on InCipher, but one of the other things I thought I would throw out there is one of the other options to look at as far as long term is the new HSM as a service that InCipher has, where rather than having your own physical HSMs, you're really relying on a cloud neutral provider like InCipher to do it. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, absolutely. So we released our InShield as a service option about half a year ago, and so this is exactly as Mark says, managed hardware security modules that we make available to you as a customer, initialize into your own security world, and we can either have you do the security officer role for yourself, where you have the cards and you use the remote admin. We built this entirely around our remote admin capability, right? So that's how much faith we have in that feature. It is fully vetted and fully ready to go. Or we can take on the role of security officer for you, where we maintain the admin card set. We put that under our controls, under our process and procedures, to give you a usable HSM right off the bat that you can hook up your online CAs to. Of course, for offline, we'll have to figure out what it means to be an offline route in this scenario, because
offline and connected at the same time.
Yeah, exactly, and that's a little bit of a paradigm shift. What is an offline CA? Is it if the authorizing smart cards are offline, or does the CA database have to be offline, et cetera? So that's a distinction that we can make. But I did want to put this up here because it's an option that we have now, and we very much designed it with the idea in mind that these are HSMs that you can never visit.
Yeah. So it's almost kind of like you guys were kind of planning for COVID, but now everyone else is kind of in the place of, well, we do have them. How do we get out there? And we can see some of the things that we touched on, like the trusted validation devices of how our key ceremonies done for these HSMs when they're remote. It's done through the trusted validation devices. So I think that the key that I heard from there is the fact that we have the capability where somebody could take their existing security world and load it into the HSM as a service. So somebody could look at this to say, I want to migrate from what I have into the HSM as a service. I don't have to rebuild my PKI because my keys are in my security world. I don't have to rewrap things. It's really a matter of getting the existing security world loaded onto the service.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, perfect. There's definitely some uplift and some challenges and going from existing on-prem with offline systems and online systems. So it doesn't solve every single scenario, but it certainly does enable organizations that are looking at hardware security modules or what they currently have today and planning for how are we going to facilitate these things remotely. And enabling our infrastructure to work. So there's definitely some of those things to consider. And like I said, really start thinking now, because a lot of this stuff doesn't happen overnight, whether it's changing your key ceremony and your audit process, looking at trusted validation devices, or maybe even going so far as HSM as a service. These things are going to take a little bit of time, but they're all available. The number one thing that you have hopefully on your side is the fact that you're now aware of it. And as we all kind of turn our attention from the immediacy of enablement and really kind of start thinking about how are we going to adapt and function in this space for a long period of time is really important. Sandra, anything else you want to touch on here before we start taking some Q&A?
I think that's about all I had.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. That was great. So we have quite a few questions. So let's start off with one from Joe, who's asking if he would be interested to know if you could talk about best practices for building registration authorities that could be safely exposed externally, so that, for example, trusted home workers could register their own laptops, or a certificate could be downloaded and then be used as a posture check when remote users connect either to the corporate network or to the cloud. So kind of an open question.
Yeah, I'll take that one to start, and we'll see what Sandra wants to add in. The way I always look at this is whether we're talking about RAs on the internet or we're talking about traditional enrollment, the point of acquisition, that initial identity really tends to be the weakest point in the chain. Once we actually get a certificate and carries forward, that the cryptographic capabilities are the same. It's ultimately a matter of what was the ease of getting a certificate and how strongly was that identity verified. And that is often really the real question here. So if we think about what does it take to put an RA and make it internet facing, ultimately kind of goes to how strong do you need that identity? If we're really looking at, frankly, just from a technology perspective, I want some error messages to go away in my VPN client, and no, I'm just going to not tell anyone about my URL. Technically, it works, right? You could get a certificate and you can use the VPN, but it's not very secure. If we're relying on usernames and passwords, the strength of those usernames and passwords are really the only gatekeeper to getting the certificate. So for me, I would really start thinking about how can we put an acceptable level of security in front of whatever that RA process is going to be. So you could look at other places in your organization, and perhaps you're already using Office 365 with MFA. And you can say, oh, that is an acceptable level of security for certain types of controls. So maybe you can design an identity process that leverages that. Somebody has to sign in with MFA and they submit some information, or they upload some information, or you're doing things like providing one-time passwords and you're using a Teams video conference, something where you're verifying who's on the other end of these things. Now, it doesn't necessarily scale to the millions of people autonomously, but if you can have the right security control in place, then you have a much better control over who's accessing and getting these identities. Sandra, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think things like it depends on what your provisioning process is and what you can fit in to make the registration stronger, make the registration process as strong as you need it to be. So, are you able to pre-populate the device? maybe not. Maybe people bring their own devices, or they get they get one from a vendor that they need to sign up to these, or maybe they need to use their home PCs in a pinch or something like that. A one-time code, a text message, etc. Anything that has a limited lifetime, that does not exist outside the context of that registration, could be a token to feed into the registration process. So whatever the technology is that, and I don't know a lot about the individual technologies for this access control, but whatever you can do to do this, to jumpstart, to bootstrap this one-time process, preferably through an out-of-band means, would serve to strengthen this proposition.
Yep. The front. It's all about the front end.
Yep.
All right. Thank you. So I think this question is for Randall. It's from Randall. It's for Sander. It's can multiple InShield TVDs be used from separate locations to provide or present a quorum of remote admin cards?
Yeah, and so we talked about the trusted verification devices. Yes, we can assemble a quorum from multiple devices, and so those devices would have to be registered with the HSM. There is, of course, some configuration and planning involved with that. The link has to be in place, but yeah, then we can read cards as we assemble a card set quorum. The HSM can read cards from multiple card readers, with the caveat that the passphrases to those cards, they do not come with the cards, they come from the application that assembles the quorum. And so that is a circumstance that you'd have to plan for and do what is necessary, pre-sharing the passphrase and then changing it afterwards, while maintaining the two factors of the card and the passphrase in different places. Or maybe you have a WebEx where you hand around the control between the parties that have to put in passphrases in turn in order to get those prompts, get those cards read and authorized.
Okay. And Thomas is asking, do you see any issues with creating a root CRL that lasts as long as the root CA certificate, but only publishes CRL in case of an emergency, or as a last resort when you can't get to your root CA as to publish a new CRL?
I'll take that one. I do see problems with it. The problem is systems cache revocation information, or we should at least assume everything will. If we have a root CA that's good for 20 years, that means if that CRL is ever used, essentially we'll never be able to revoke anything again, because we may be able to delete that CRL from a CDP location and put a new file there, but we don't know what's cached it, and we'll never really have that certainty. So we're kind of left in this state of, well, maybe I got it, maybe I didn't do it. The closest that I've seen that people do here is when they do their regular CRL publishing, they'll also create a secondary CRL, or really it's just another CRL at the same time that's good for a year. So they're creating their normal 3-month or their 6-month. They'll create the 1 year and they'll leave it to the side. And then if they ever have to use it, they have it available. And then worst case, if they put it out there and it gets cached, it's a year. And here's the challenge is people make mistakes. And if you have a CRL that's good for 20 years or 5 years or 10 years, it may just accidentally get copied out there, regardless of what you do. And the moment it's out there, you may not even necessarily know if anything's actually ever even picked it up. And then you're kind of left in this, did that actually get published? Did anyone see it? Okay, now we're in trouble.
Yeah, if it exists, you should consider it to be out there. And that is, I imagine, I've never been audited that way, but for an auditor would be very, very much a red flag of, here is something that is out of your control, right? Yeah. If it exists, it's out of your control.
And not only that, it's technically a security workaround of if I'm going to compromise your environment, and I happen to see that you created this 20-year CRL, I essentially know I could do anything I want in an environment, and you'll never be able to revoke anything I've done. So its mere existence is kind of waiting to be used for nefarious purposes. And if we boil down to the beginning of it, we're really trying to make a precautionary move in case something happens. There's probably better controls that we can do, like the CRL resigning of how can I reassemble my CA key, even off of my CA, and just resign an existing CRL when I need. And we call that emergency CRL resigning. So if you have that process, we don't have to pre-stage or pre-create a 20-year CRL. We simply say, we know where our backups are. We know how to assemble our quorum if we have one. We're going to copy the existing CRL and resign it.
All right. So we probably have a few more minutes left. We have quite a number of questions left. Kevin is asking, what's the best practice for CRL's lifetime publishing interval for an offline route with a 10-year cert?
Sandra, do you want to take that one first? I'm curious on what your thoughts are.
Oh dear. You run the question by me again.
No worries. I'll reread it and I'll take a first stab. So Kevin was asking the best practices for a CRL lifetime if we have an offline route with a 10-year cert. So what I would say is, regardless of the CA lifetime, the CRL is really an independent beast. So whether the route was good for a year or 20 years, I don't see the CRL publishing being affected by that. For me, that the CRL is really a balance of how frequently do I need to get information out about something that is revoked, and at the same time, how do I make sure I don't have too great of a dependency where it becomes too difficult. So in the case of an offline system, I don't want to have a CRL that's created every day. That's a big upkeep to take care of. But I also don't want a CRL that's good for 10 years. I'll never effectively be able to revoke anything. So it's a balancing act. What we typically find, regardless of the CA lifetimes, most organizations are publishing their CRL once or twice a year. The more frequent, the more updated. But at the same time, we're talking about a root CA that really should only be revoking a subordinate CA that's on the network in your data center. That should be something that is extremely unlikely to occur compared to an end entity cert on a laptop that could be stolen. So most organizations wind up in that 1 or 2 times a year, but it may go up to as many as 4 times a year.
Yeah, and it comes down to also the lifetime of your subordinate CAs, as Mark says, but also the length of exposure that you're willing to accept should something happen to that subordinate CA. What are the controls on that subordinate CA? How hard would it be to compromise? What is your exposure there? Because the CRLs you put out there, as we talked about already in the previous question, the CRLs you put out there are, they are the absolute source of trust for those subordinates, for those endpoints, about the relationship between the root and the issuing CA.
Okay. And Beth asks has a question regarding doing a root ceremony, key ceremony over Microsoft Teams. So would you have resources for the contingency of doing that?
Yeah, have you done anything like that, Sandra? Done kind of remote ceremonies, video conferencing sort of setups?
It's something we've tried and tested. So this is what I talked about with the you would have trusted verification devices in multiple places, cards in multiple places, and then you would hand around control of that screen share that is actually peeking into the actual operation of the signing, and have people put in the passphrase for the card that is currently being read. Right, so the HSM will prompt in sequence the sequence that it determines of where are its card readers are in its list. It'll prompt for passphrases for the individual cards, and so that is something. And we have internally tested that. I have not personally seen it used in anger in the field, but it's been done.
Yeah. One interesting thing is we'll probably find that you get better documentation doing it that way, because a lot of organizations don't record their key ceremonies. And the one nice thing is if you are doing Teams or WebEx or something like that, you could still have an auditor witnessing what's going on. You can visually verify who's there. You could still have someone running the ceremony, and you can record it and save it for posterity along with your other PKI documentation. So in some ways, there may be some nice mitigating reasons to do it over a teleconference like that.
Okay, great. Dennis is asking, we use the remote administration kit. We have problems with OCS cards with a passphrase. We connected us from other location over RDP on our enterprise CAs. The form to authenticate always displays in one RDP session. Is there another solution?
Yeah, so that is what I talked about. You would have one RDP session that instigates the operation, and that is the one that gets the card prompts. And so I know we've had some technology shifts over the years. Initially, for when we went to Windows 2003 a while ago, we started prompting in session 0. And so at that point, it was a matter of RDP session grabs session 0 and can then see that card prompt. Microsoft has moved away from that and has asked us to move away from that approach, and we've done that. I actually I don't know where we are on this. So Dennis, please talk to our support team, and we'll help you out as best we can. But as I said, that card prompt, that application runs in a single context in a single session. So instead of having multiple RDP sessions into the same box, I think you may be we may have to limit you to taking a single RDP session and then putting that on a screen share on Teams, and then handing control of that session around.
Okay. So Edward asks, what are the compensating controls you would need to perform key ceremony outside the data center?
That's an interesting set of things. I think when we start thinking about key ceremonies outside of the data center, we can think a little bit about what were we depending on the data center for. Sometimes we'll have card sets that are stored inside of a safe inside of the data center, or we were using the data center to record physical access to the CAs as part of our ceremonies. So I think we kind of need to look at what the ceremony is. Now, are people already in possession of the cards with passphrases, and that really doesn't change simply because they're in the data center or outside of the data center? I think probably the biggest compensating control you could do is to really use video conferencing. I think whether it's Teams or WebEx, the ability to have people presented, verify that they're inserting a card, that they're doing the work that they would normally do and can be audited and tracked is probably the biggest thing that we can come up with. If we have to accommodate things like the fact that they're not normally in possession of their cards, we do have to get a little creative about how are we going to get people their cards, how are we going to control that, and maybe it's really kind of a checkout process. There's probably not a great answer here because you may be depending on having multiple people present when you open a safe and getting the cards out, and maybe you haven't used passphrases in the past. So you're going to have to think through some of these things, and maybe that's where the earlier FaceTime comes up of somebody's going to go into the safe and bring the FaceTime camera with them so that can be at least witnessed, and then they're kind of scrubbed down and handed out to individuals or something like that. But there's going to be some creativity that's involved there.
Yeah, definitely. It's and as Mark says, it depends on the controls you're enforcing, and of course, it's ultimately up to your auditor, but your auditor can't give you advice. They can just audit what you did, and so it's kind of a little dance, and that dance is something that under these circumstances we may have to just kind of shortcut, and maybe all get on a video conference and decide this is what we are going to put in place. And as Mark says, what do we depend on the original location and the physical separation for what are the controls we can put in? Can we say, if we do a remote session, how do the cards get to the individual operators? What are the controls on that? And how do we verify that those cards got there? Do we put them in a tea bag, tamper evident authenticated bag on their way? Do we talk through all of the things we can do there? How do we ensure that the individual participants' environments are secure, that there is no camera behind us that shoulder serves the passphrases, etc.? Are we moving to a different room in the office where we can maintain the social distancing? Are there any cameras, etc.? So those are all things that we have to talk through before we do these ceremonies, and make a plan and make sure that everybody agrees on the plan up to and including the auditor.
Okay. Well, we are approaching the top of the hour. We have a few time for a couple more questions. Few for you, Sander. Come in. They're asking, is NCipher now FedRAMP? And then also asking about HSM as a service, what countries are available, and whether or not HSM as a service could be used to protect company data, such as in Azure or Office 365.
Yeah, okay, so I can answer those very quickly. So we are working on a FedRAMP certification. And if you know FedRAMP a little bit, then you know that this is a fairly involved and long time process that it involves a lot of documentation, a lot of controls, a lot of checklists, and also if you work for a sponsoring agency, get in touch, because we would rather go through you for our ATO than to go to the Joint Advisory Board. We learned that this is a much more straightforward process to go through an individual agency. Regarding countries, we are currently deployed in the United States and in the United Kingdom. So we have those locations up and running, and well, of course, those are reachable from throughout the world, and then it becomes it comes down to what your requirements are for where your data is, where your keys are, where the keys can be used, what that dance is to whether you can use that in other countries. Of course, if you have your deployment in a separate country where your data resides, can you then say, okay, my HSMs and their initialization state are in the UK or in the US, and can we do that? So, and what was the last question? Can we be used from Azure Office 365? Yes, we can be used from Azure. HSMs are located in our data centers. We set up VPNs to the data centers from wherever your cloud operations are. And so the requirement currently is that you can run our client software. So that you have a virtual machine in Azure that runs our client software and runs your application that uses our client software. So it's very much the same HSM that we have on premise, just translated to an online cloud accessible situation.
Okay, Mark, did you have any last thoughts or any more questions that you saw on the list you wanted to tackle?
No, I think we're good. I would just kind of reiterate that, hopefully organizations will take this opportunity to, look at their environment. Just run PKI view.msc. If you're running a Microsoft Windows PKI, PKI view.msc will just give you a quick snapshot of your environment. Figure out when your CRLs are coming up, if you have any offline systems that are due for renewal, and start planning now. Even if you got a few months down the road, maybe still take that into account and assume that for the foreseeable future, we're going to be working this way. And if you've got more time, then you've got more options.
Okay.
Yep. Definitely be prepared. Like the old Boy Scout mantra is knowing what the issues are, being prepared to solve them is paramount in this situation.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and the replay of this will be posted online if you're interested, and we'll also try to address some of the questions that we didn't get to in via direct messaging. So thank you very much for participating. I hope it was valuable and useful to you.
Thanks, everyone.